you know, we still need the stories, whether we read modern novels or not. It's like, you know, we need that connection, whether it's with our elders or with our kids. You know, we pass these stories on as something precious. For me personally, it's probably just the unknown, you know. I've always been drawn more to the unknown and whatever the beyond of normal life. So I would actually go out and look for these. You know, we would go to haunted houses. We would go to haunted areas of the cities. See what was going on, you know? Yeah, now, whatever that comes from, I don't know. But it kept life interesting.
It was almost like an escape.
Definitely an escape. Family life was not a happy life. So that was an escape, definitely.
Hey, welcome to the Floaties for Krakens Podcast. I am your host, Camille Maria Costa, and it is a brilliant day to be monstrous. Howdy, 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 Cuttlefish. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 16 of the Floaties for Krakens Podcast, a show all about the monsters in our head, but reclaiming them instead. I'm so thrilled that you could join us today. Okay, everybody, do something for me. Take a deep breath in, hold it for just a couple of seconds. Now take a deep breath out. If you could hold your arms out in front of you, shake them around a little bit, get the blood flowing. Place your left hand over your right shoulder, and place your right hand over your left shoulder. Now hug yourself real tight and say, "Hey, buddy, I'm proud of you. Whatever happens today, I'm just so happy to be doing it with you." It's tough out there right now, kids, so just be kind to yourselves and make sure to grab a tall glass of water and a second yummy beverage and a delicious snack for this episode today, okay? Just please, because this episode really is a treat, and you deserve a treat too. I have the pleasure of introducing a brilliant human to the pod today, an author, a creative, and someone who truly looks out for communities that are often overlooked. Just the kindest soul through and through, and we are just so lucky to have them grace Floaties for this episode. We have for you today Tyler Battaglia. Tyler, he, Yale, Eni, is a queer and disabled author of horror, dark and urban fantasy, and other speculative fiction, who is especially interested in subjects that interrogate the connections between faith, monsters, love, queerness, and disability. Tyler lives in Canada with his partner and a grumpy cat. Shout out to the grumpy cat. Tyler is such a freaking superstar, literally. He is such a thoughtful writer, and it is so evident in every piece of writing that he has. I seriously urge all of you to go check out Pray for Him, please, and all of the up-and-coming work he has on the horizon, because it's going to be amazing. It's going to blow your mind. Thank you, Tyler, for allowing us to chat with you on the show, and for simply being so enlightening throughout our entire conversation. You are helping so many children feel understood, especially in a very delicate time where those in power are telling them that they shouldn't be. Just thank you. And I'm just so happy that they have you. Truly. Keep writing, and we will definitely keep reading. Just a quick content warning for this episode. In the following interview, there will be mentions and discussions of homophobia, ableism, possession, religious trauma, gender trauma, generational trauma, mental health difficulties, anxiety, and depression in this episode. Do whatever you need to do to feel safe. Alrighty, Cuttlefish. Let me introduce to you library cards for demons. Hi, Tyler. Again.
Hello, nice to meet you properly.
It's lovely to meet you too. How are you?
I'm doing all right, staying warm in the snowstorm that's outside, but otherwise doing okay.
I know we were just talking about it briefly, but you said you had like 40 centimeters of snow or something like that?
Yeah, close to that the other day, and it's supposed to be a similar amount throughout the day today, so this
Woof.
might be why I write about winter a lot too, but it's so
Ooh,
familiar.
so it's definitely, I feel like, putting everybody in the right mindset for
Yes,
for this
yes, it
conversation.
feels appropriate. The cozy tea with the snow
Yeah.
outside. Yeah.
Spooky things.
hmm
Yeah.
hmm
Just our normal Sunday.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, Tyler, for those of us that may not know, can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, of course. So, my name's Tyler Battaglia. I'm an author of mostly horror, but with kind of a horror romance bent. But I also write from time to time dark fantasy, those sorts of things as well. Occasionally more cozy stuff as well, but a lot
Mm.
of it veers into that kind of like horror romance space with the contrast of like the grotesque and the beautiful. Those are the sorts of things that really draw me in. So it's the sort of thing that I've been drawn to as a writer as well. I have one novel published called Pray for Him, came out last fall. And I have a number of short stories as well that kind of cross the vein from short little flash fiction character explorations to longer pieces that explore different dynamics as well. Although, as I said, kind of generally in the same sort of vein of like topics and thematics.
So sick. Just so freaking cool. And, you know, I'm definitely, obviously, going to pick your brain about the spooky, the
Happy
grotesque,
to.
as you mentioned.
Mhm,
But I'm really curious, how did writing kind of find you, Tyler, or like what drew you to that
mhm.
world?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I was raised by a single dad, and we moved around a lot as a kid, just lack of kind of regular stability. And so I tended to kind of not necessarily have a lot of like solid friend groups or anything. And so one of the comforts that kind of came along that was very standard for me was being able to read, to tell stories, those sorts of things. So I was always the kid with my nose in a book.
Yeah.
When we had a it's not everywhere I grew up necessarily had an easily accessible public library, but when we did, I'd get my dad to take me there all the time. And he would have to put limits sometimes to be like, okay, wait, you have to get a couple books this time, so I don't have to take you back tomorrow. You got to be at least a few days between library trips. So that was just something that was always sort of a part of my life as a kid, was being really pulled into storytelling, into books, into reading, and eventually kind of started trying my hand at telling stories myself. First with like other kids, and then eventually starting to like write it down and try to find these stories myself. I remember in grade seven, I think it was, we were told to write a short story, and I got a good grade on the assignment, so this wording's going to be misleading, but I failed the assignment in that it was not a short story. I never finished it. It was like so many pages over the limit they gave me. But I felt really proud of myself because the other kids liked it enough that they were like, "Oh, can you read us a second chapter?" The fact that it had chapters at all tells you I
It's
missed the missed
iconic.
the did not succeed at a short story at the time, which is a little funny now that most of my publications are short stories. But I was just so
Yeah.
excited about trying to tell this world and this story in this world that at the time that it kind of really got out of my hands.
Which is, I think, a beautiful accident because
Yeah,
I clearly, like, the entire class loved it, which is so awesome.
I hope so. I hope they weren't just being nice to me.
Listen, I highly doubt that. Okay. Like, I feel like there was something that really drew them in with your characters, right? And your storyline. Like, that's so awesome. And I love that, like, I imagine your teacher was like so encouraging, right? To be
Yeah, I
like,
was I
keep
was lucky to
going.
mostly have teachers who were pretty encouraging about this sort of thing as a kid. Not to say, we all have our upsets and sort of things, and school's not a fun time all the time as a kid, that's for sure. But I mostly
100%.
had teachers who were like fairly encouraging and tried to be supportive, and definitely thankful for that. That for
Yeah.
the most part, I lucked out in that space.
Yeah, it goes such a long way
hmm
to be seen
hmm
by someone that I don't know that finally tells you like your voice is really important and like
hmm
creative and people want to hear what you have to say. Like
hmm
that's
Yeah, which was
awesome.
your phrasing's a little ironic because, as I mentioned when we were setting up for this, I'm hard of hearing, and I that kind of impacted my ability to socialize with other kids as well. I didn't have hearing aids for a really long time when I was a kid. I didn't get them till much older in my life,
Yeah.
and that made it hard sometimes because you can't really always explain that very well to other kids,
Mm.
and you don't always have the vocabulary for it at that age. So
Oh.
yeah, as you say, like being given a space to be heard and, listened to in that space is a little ironic, the phrasing, but I think that was also an important sort of element of that to be able to find those spaces.
Mm. That's amazing. I love that you had that outlet and that
Hmm.
medium of communication.
Hmm.
And it can be shared at such like a vulnerable level. That's the magic of storytelling and
Hmm.
books and writing, right? Is that you
Yeah.
can relate so much to the person
Hmm.
across the street from you or whatever, right? That you may not
Absolutely.
have known before. That
Absolutely.
that's that's so great. And shout out to public library, shout out to your
Absolutely. Shout out to
dad
public library.
for nurturing that,
Yeah.
that love of reading.
Yeah, he was a big reader himself, although does not at all read the same sort of thing as me, which was it's a little bit funny. I never have to worry about him reading anything I don't want him to read because he won't touch horror with a 10-foot pole.
That's funny.
He tries to be supportive, but it's very obvious he's not, comfortable reading it, and that's okay. I'm okay with
Fair.
that. But I think that it helped that he kind of made that space to be like, even if he wasn't always able to be as around as he might have liked to be, that he was able to be like, okay, well, I can at least do this for you and nurture this sort of
Mm.
love of reading.
Yeah. You can really connect in that way
Hmm.
to
Yeah,
those, like you said, daily or weekly library visits
yeah,
and
yeah.
talk about the stories you both read. Like
Hmm. Hmm.
that's such a deep connection.
Yeah, and then when I racked up overdue library fees because I took too many books out and overestimated my ability to read them, my dad taking the fall to go in. Although they were very kind to him and waived the fees sometimes because they're like, okay, this is clearly not your fault. We're not going to make you hold this. But very
It
sweet of the librarians too.
I mean, of course, like come on. Like you're a child. Of course you're going to want to read everything and not turn anything in on time. That's the point. That's so sweet of your father though, I think. So,
Yeah, I think
okay.
he did his best.
Oh, go for it. Go for it, Tyler.
Oh, I was just gonna say he definitely did his best in that respect. So I'm
Right.
sure it was tough on him being a single dad raising these two kids, but because I have a brother as well.
Yeah.
But that was one thing that I think where he was like, okay, this is one thing I know I can do right. I encourage the reading. That's a good habit.
It's fantastic. I love that. Like that's I don't know. Great parenting. It seems. Yeah. Okay, so you did mention, right, that
Mhm.
like your I guess the type of books you were pulling off the shelves were a
Mhm.
little bit different than maybe
Mhm.
that your dad was pulling up. So, how did the world of maybe horror, right, and the spooky
Mhm.
other, like how did that come into play? Like what drew you to that?
Mhm. So the funny thing is horror itself didn't pull me in right away. And there's
Yeah.
is in some respects it did because a lot of the books that I read as a kid tended to veer towards a little bit darker materials, at least for the age range. Like I was a big fan of the Animorph series in the 90s and early 2000s,
Yeah.
and those books got dark.
Yes,
And you
they
didn't always
did.
realize as a kid just how dark they were getting, but then you kind of think back on them and it's like, oh man, I was reading that at like 7 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but
Frightening.
the on the other hand, horror movies in particular scared me so bad I couldn't even watch trailers for a
Oh
long time.
no. Yes.
And I personally put the blame on a maybe ill-advised move on a babysitter, where their older than me child put on the Blair Witch Project, and I was like, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years old when that movie came out.
Tyler.
And so I was so scared as a kid. And so many people back in the 90s didn't were like, "Wait, is this real? Maybe it
Yeah.
is." And so
Yeah.
little me was like watching it through my fingers, behind a pillow, all those sorts of things. I don't think the babysitter had any idea that their child had done this. But I won't say it scarred me for life, but like a little shy of that maybe. So I was really scared of like what I viewed as the big fish horror for a long time there. Um, so I avoided kind of a lot of movies and shows that were in that space, and so
Yeah.
it was through reading and eventually through writing that I kind of like dipped my toes into that space through the books that get a little darker, and that kind of slowly built the way up to reading the more of the bigger horror books. Um,
Yeah.
I don't have the story that a lot of horror writers do, where it's like I read my first Stephen King at the age of 12, but I did read Interview with the Vampire and watch that movie in my early
Yes.
teens, the 90s movie. Um, and that one was one of those ones where it's like, might have been a little too young for that. But since my dad didn't touch horror, he didn't know what I was watching or
Not at
reading when it
all.
started to get to that. So
Yeah.
that I think was another like kind of formative one. And because of the more like I'll say sensual nature of that versus some of the horror that I saw when I was younger, that it kind of like turned me off of it initially, started to kind of open up that space to be like, wait, maybe there's something here.
Yeah. See, I love that though. I love like the funny little ways that we explore genre growing up
Hmm.
or are forced into that world. I can't, I mean, Blair Witch Project is scary now, right? Like as adults, like that,
Hmm. Hmm.
very scary. I can only imagine how it felt in that moment. And like you said, right? Is this real? Is this happening?
Hmm. Yeah,
But
and when you're like adults didn't even necessarily feel that confident at the time because of the way they'd like gone about this. Never mind when you're like a little kid, like what am I watching?
right, like barely forming your own thoughts. And it's like,
Yeah.
great. Okay, good to know. Good to know this is in the woods. Like, I'm so
Hmm.
happy. Yeah, like,
Exactly.
and I mean, I think it's awesome, right? Because the whole point of the show, right, is like
Hmm.
there's not really one way to define horror.
Hmm.
Right, like there are so many different ways that you can express
Hmm.
fear and terror and horror in that way, and sometimes it morphs into fantasy, right, or
Hmm.
sci-fi, or like I mean, there's so many fun ways that you can approach it, which is why I think it's brilliant that like the pen on paper stereotypical definition of horror, right, as you say, like
Hmm.
found you later, but I
Yeah.
think that's what's cool because you have all these other brilliant genres under your belt and ways of imagining
Hmm.
worlds and characters, so that brings such a beautiful freshness, I think, to horror creation.
Yeah, I think it's given kind of a different perspective on it because, as you said, there's also so many subgenres of horror that,
Yeah.
not to say there's necessarily a horror for everyone, because the idea of horror itself is that it's supposed to be transgressive and push boundaries, and some people that's going to be a no go in a lot of ways, like from the
Sure.
start. But
Sure.
there's such a variety in terms of kind of like the depth, the subject matter, the type. There's a lot of kind of religious horror elements to what I write that's sort of like adjacent to cosmic horror in some ways, where you're thinking
Mhm.
about this kind of like broader reality and universe that's like hard to understand. But then you
Yeah.
also have stuff that's a lot more grounded, or the things that kind of blend the two, where, thinking about, to use a Stephen King quote, because I mentioned him earlier, the kind of like, what is it? Inhuman places make human monsters, something to that effect. I probably don't have that quite right, but
I think
something
you're
about that
right.
kind of like blurring the line between what is the human monster and the monstrous. So,
Mm.
that sort of piece as well, where, it's not always clear exactly what the real horror is.
Oh, which makes it so enticing.
Hmm.
And for lack of a better term, a real page turner, I feel
Hmm.
like horror is.
Hmm.
Well, since you mentioned the term, Tyler, I'm curious. In your opinion, right, what do you think a monster is?
Yeah, I think that there's a whole study dedicated to this, as you're of course well aware. So it's obviously not a simple answer, but
Never.
to me, I think the monster is really about thinking about that externalization of our fears. And when you think about some of the like classic monsters, you think about the Wolfman, the classic horror movies, or Frankenstein and Frankenstein's creation from the classic novel, all that. It's frequently kind of this blurring of the line of like which one is the monster. Um, Thinking about the Wolfman movies from the 30s, it's somebody who is himself very human who is forced to become monstrous, but
Mm.
then it's also that external reaction to him that sort of makes it the monster. So I think it's this externalization. It's this frequently, of course, it's very symbolic, thinking about what is actually the monster, what does it represent. But that's also maybe why I've been so drawn to the concept of monsters in general, is feeling sometimes like you are yourself an outsider. For myself, whether it's because I'm queer or disabled, or just because I didn't have the stability necessarily as a child all the time, that you kind of feel like you're on the outside a little bit, that
Yeah.
sort of like, not ostracization per se, but the empathy that comes with that, to understand that that's sort of this externalization of the anxieties and the fears there.
Mm. Oh, I love that. There's so many beautiful layered things that you said that I'm gonna pick apart. Of course I am, because I'm
Of
excited.
course.
So, okay, first of all, I love that you said the reaction, right, to the
Hmm.
concept of a monster itself is monstrous in
Hmm.
itself, right? That almost exists as its own
Hmm.
sentient being, right? This fear, this external fear or
Hmm.
opposition or what have you, right? To something that is monstrous,
Yeah,
maybe deemed monstrous by society, um, which is also so complex as you mentioned, right? Like who gets to call who a monster and by what
absolutely.
defines, right? Like what context?
Hmm.
How do you have that privilege,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And when thinking about the roots of a lot of these kind of mainstays of the genre, you then also kind of add the social element that's really informed by the times they exist in too. Like,
Mm,
think about, because I made reference to the Wolfman movie because that's a favorite like classic horror movie.
yes.
The idea of they have this Romani character as well, and the way that people have been themselves ostracized, and the way that they are also viewed through this kind of like distance lens. And obviously, it's not the sort of thing that would be considered like an acceptable storytelling method today, like the
Mm,
kind of racist, xenophobic undertones of what was happening in that
yeah,
film.
yeah.
But it adds this other layer about how the monster is perceived, how the other is perceived.
Mm, so well said. It's funny how the exploration of monster and monstrosity, right, really is a reflection of society and very
Hmm.
telling of, humanity. That's really, unfortunately, how you learn a lot about it, right?
Hmm.
And you had mentioned earlier, Tyler, right? For a lot of people, like in the queer community, for example,
Hmm.
right? Like there has been so much freedom and solace in
Hmm.
horror, in the exploration of the monster. Of course, not for everybody, absolutely. As we just said, right? Horror is not, everybody's
Yeah,
cup of
of
tea
course.
per se. Um, but it's very telling when a group and I know you said too, and like maybe not necessarily ostracized per se, but that
Hmm.
feels different. That feels, I don't know, just not with the status quo, right? Because you don't get
Hmm.
to write the status quo. Like you find yourself identifying so much with the monstrous character.
Hmm. And
And
if
yeah,
we
yeah.
think about kind of how the monster is the other in this respect, I think there's a lot of sympathy to be found there as well in terms of how this otherness is portrayed. Whether we're
Mhm.
thinking about these, stereotypes that are built on people of color, like I alluded to earlier with the Romani characters in some of these classic movies, but also thinking about how much queer coding has existed in the villainous, how often, body differences are used as a form of horror. Body horror as a whole subgenre crosses that line so often, and it's a very delicate balance that I think people aren't always even necessarily aware of. Is
Yeah.
where is that line between fear of the body and fear of disability? And
Ooh.
is what's that space look like? Like it's such a complex thing, and I think that's
Mm,
why, at least for myself, it's easy to be drawn into this genre and this space is to try and understand better how do you reclaim that as well, how do
mm,
you make it a safe space for myself as a queer and disabled person who wants to play in this genre without crossing that line.
mm. You're right. It's such a delicate line, a delicate
Hmm.
balance. But I think that key word that you utilize, right, reclaim, like a
Hmm.
reclamation, is so empowering in and of itself. And I mean, that's why, authors like yourself, right, are so phenomenal in this world because we need you, right? Like so many groups and communities and people that just don't see themselves represented or
Hmm.
represented well, like need true authors like yourself to just put it on paper, just to explain and to express how so many people feel. And I think that's what's so fun too about exploring horror and that genre is it's so creative the ways that you can really express your personal feelings, right? Because it is
Hmm.
with maybe a monster, right? Maybe it's very extravagant, maybe it's very performative, maybe it's not, right? Maybe it's very realistic, but like it's just a really fun way and difficult and complex, yes, but to communicate, I
For
think,
sure, for
feelings.
sure. Yeah, and there's a lot of, especially in the indie space, although I'm maybe a little bit biased, there's a lot of authors who are pushing a lot of boundaries there in a
Yes.
way that's not necessarily allowable if you're operating within the traditional publishing landscape.
Mm,
Because, so many people have felt when they follow that route that they feel a pressure to kind of self censor and self sanitize to be more acceptable to the status quo. And there's more and more people who are rejecting that impulse and saying, I want to be true to my own form of self expression. So they pursue these other methods. And, for some people, traditional publishing remains kind of the route that's good for them. There's
sure.
so many benefits to it as well.
Yeah.
But I know so many authors who have said, like, I want to carve out my own space because I want to make sure that it is wholly unapologetically me.
Mm. That absolutely. But it's wild to think like I don't know, censorship has just been like I feel like the hot ticket item as of late. We live
For
in a
sure.
very interesting time right
Mhm.
now and today, and the arts are just mm, so important. Like they're just
Mhm.
so freaking important. And being able to express yourself wholeheartedly, right, in whatever way you choose to do is so freaking necessary on so many levels. And
Mhm.
I agree with you, right? Like indie writers and like indie art in general,
Mhm.
right? In the small corners of the internet or wherever you find it, right? Is so it is like a little gem. Because it is oftentimes so personal and vulnerable and really like as you said earlier pushing the boundaries, right, and testing the waters and
Mhm.
I don't know, like that's what so many people need.
Yeah. And
They
it's not just with horror either, even,
mm,
thinking about the sort of things people are writing in, like, the romance space. It's
yeah.
not as easy to find necessarily in kind of the traditional spaces where the status quo has defined beauty norms to find romance stories that center, like, disabled bodies, queer bodies, and so
Mm,
on.
mm,
So that's also a space that people have continuously, like, began to carve out for themselves more and more, and romance in particular is a genre that thrives in the indie space.
yes.
So shout out to all my peers who write in that genre, kind of the so and so called pure romance, in that mine is sort of a genre romance.
Oh, that's
Um,
awesome.
but that's been a really cool space to see continue to evolve and thrive, as well as people carving out these spaces where there's a more of a recognition of the diversity of love out there,
Mhm.
of attraction, and so on.
Yes. Absolutely. Like, I mean, and it's, I don't know, like, I feel like when we're young children, right, and we're told all of these things about how love is supposed to look like and how it's
Hmm.
supposed to feel, and let alone like you just dealing with your own middle school body in the first place, right, is so complicated because it's just so much is going on in middle school, for example, right?
Hmm.
And like, I don't know, like finding those pieces of romance are like so fruitful,
Hmm.
especially when they tell it like it is and they make you feel see they write about you, people and children and kids and like are as strange weirdos, right, like seeing you represented in a
Hmm.
romance story, short story, novel, whatever it may
Hmm.
be, is iconic. Like it's so I don't know, you can just breathe finally when you read content like that, and it's awesome. It's so awesome.
Yeah, it's been really nice kind of finding my own space in the indie kind of publishing sphere, and how many people are just super welcoming too and there to
Mhm.
try and, like, help you along, and those who have maybe are like the quote unquote elders of publishing, in that they've been doing it for longer and they're willing to, like, kind of help you through it and help you find that space as well. So I find the
Yeah.
community aspect tends to feel stronger too overall, at least from what I've seen comparatively, because you kind of it's your peer network who's helping you out for the most part.
Mhm.
In traditional publishing, of course, you hypothetically at least have editors, publishers, marketing teams to do all that support for you. But
Sure.
in the indie space, you have to carve your own path and do these things yourself. But there are so many people who are willing to say, like, oh, I know how to do this. Let me help you out. Let me give you tips, whatever. And so I find that community angle has made it really feel empowering in itself as well.
Oh yeah, that's so important. That's so necessary. Public, I mean, that whole world, can be so frightening and just scary and intimidating and I don't know, doing anything on
Maybe
your own.
maybe monstrous in its own right at
Maybe,
times.
right, maybe monstrous in its own way. And if you get to, I don't know, face the monster not
Mhm,
alone, in any case, right? Like that's always a win-win situation.
for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of the monster, by the way, Tyler, would you mind telling us what in the world is a demon?
So I think going back to kind of what my own kind of cultural roots for that would be,
Yeah.
and I kind of define my relationship with religion as like if I had a relationship status for it, it's complicated. Um,
Yeah.
I have Sicilian Catholic grandparents and French Catholic grandparents on another side, and it's like so it was always sort of rooted in the base of kind of like the family structure, but
Yeah.
then my own father described himself as a bad Catholic. That was his self-description of his religion because he himself has distanced himself from the organizational portion of it so much that he didn't really feel that strongly tied to it anymore.
Mhm.
And this sort of creates like a weird sort of space for me where it's like you kind of get some of the embedded cultural pieces, but without like the structure or the community portion. So it's been sort of this it's my culture, but it's also like something that I feel also sort of on the outside from, to allude to earlier piece. So that's
Yeah.
sort of where the strongest associations with demons come from. And I know a lot of like mainstream media looks to that as sort of the quintessential image as well. Um, but I think they're really interesting looking at that space because when you think about where the original idea of demons come from, according to kind of this Catholicism sort of angle, is they were themselves part originally of what might have been the original status quo.
Mm.
The first demons were also angels once.
Yeah.
So they became ostracized when they no longer fit this status quo.
Mm.
Maybe more complicated than that, but in itself, that monstrosity comes from being no longer part of that core group. They've now become an outsider.
Yeah.
And I think the lines can get, kind of blurred sometimes. We hear terms when talking about demons and the devil and those sorts of things like fallen angels. And so that association with angels is still sometimes sort of inherently there. And I
Mhm.
think that just makes it really interesting to kind of unpack where the line actually gets drawn.
Yeah. Oh, such a good point. Yes, that fall from grace, right, is such a
Exactly. Yeah.
I was raised Mexican Catholic, so I
Hmm.
really understand where you're coming from. I don't identify as religious by any
Hmm.
means, but I think just like you, it's very complicated.
Hmm.
It's an interesting world, and I always love how a lot of people, right, say like, oh yeah, my first experience with horror was Catholicism because of, I mean, there's monsters and beasts in the Bible,
Hmm.
right? There's a lot of demons, there's
Absolutely.
things, there's right, it's performative, it's wild, and
Mhm,
I love that in this definition of demon that we're using today, right? There is this sense of otherize. There is this sense of you
mhm,
are not one of us anymore.
mhm,
And that is now your entire like existence. You will forever be known, right, as that one that just doesn't fit in.
mhm,
Um, which is so powerful, and so haunting and so terrifying. And I mean, I feel like that seeps in so much. I mean, Catholic guilt is such a big thing, right? Like repenting for sins,
mhm.
and you always like you were born doing something wrong is kind of the vibe sometimes, right? Especially as kids, you're like, all right, thanks, sounds great. And so I think the demon, I mean, it's so hard to, I mean, it is religious. It's so hard to
Mhm,
pull it away. I mean, and it happens all the time, people are awesome and creative, but it's so hard sometimes to pull it away from religion, when that was its basis. That's
mhm.
how it was born. Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. And I find the way that you phrase that of like you're not one of us anymore, that key word there
yeah.
being really key to me because there's this potential you could have been part of the group.
Mm.
And it's sort of framed as inherently a negative thing and not necessarily just for demons, but like the monstrous in
Yeah.
general and the other, so to speak, where this idea that, well, you could have been, if you just were willing to stick to the status quo and like fit yourself into this acceptable moral social code that has been built, then you wouldn't have to be a monster. But then thinking about kind of the immutable characteristics of many people that kind of makes them by default ostracized. And I think
Ooh.
that's why it's so easy for a lot of these monsters to be marked by physical difference, because
Mm.
when you visually see someone as different, it's much harder for them to say, well, I'm just like you. um,
Mm.
and so you're kind of othered by default, and that kind of made monstrous by the viewer, by the person perceiving you. So I think
Yeah.
that piece is really interesting, because like, what does it take, how much do you have to kind of mold yourself and who you actually are to try and fit this to be not the anymore, not pushed out of this.
Mhm. Ooh, yes. I fitting the mold, right? Like
Hmm.
that is always the constant, I think, struggle. And since you mentioned, right,
Hmm.
visuals, right,
Hmm.
in your mind, and they're obviously, right, everybody, there are so many different ways I think that demons and demonology has been explored in
Hmm.
storytelling, right, in history, what have you. But in your mind, what do you think a demon physically, right, like looks like, if you will?
I don't know if there's necessarily like one answer to that. Just like
Yeah.
there's not really one answer to what an angel looks like either,
Yeah.
which, if we're associating them with that sort of imagery. So, there's a lot of talk online about like the biblically accurate angel, but that itself is sort of a misnomer, because sometimes angels just look like normal people too
Right.
in the Bible.
Right.
So similarly, there's not necessarily one way for a demon to look. But when we're thinking about kind of like the marks of sin, which is where what these demons are associated with, we
Yeah.
have like, for instance, the mark of Cain, where somebody has been physically marked as different based on now no longer being part of this acceptable moral code.
Mm.
So there tends to be some sort of visible difference, at least when we picture that. If we think about kind of the classic exorcism horror movie,
Mm.
usually it looks very similar to the person who is possessed, what they're supposed to, but there's some sort of, shall we say, corruption to it.
Mm.
You can think about Reagan in The Exorcist,
Right.
where there's some kind of visual, distinct way of indicating this is no longer the like innocent little girl that we were supposed to be seeing. The
Mm.
face changes with the makeup, the words appearing on her skin, those sorts of things.
Mm.
Some way to mark through the voice as well that this is no longer something that we're supposed to view as good. It is now something that has been marked as other, as evil, as a demon.
Mm. Ooh, I love this. Okay, so for people that may not know, can you explain what possession is before we get deeper into, I guess, like, right, like the visuals and the cues that make a demon a demon?
So you're going to open a whole can of worms here based on how many books on the shelf behind me deal with this topic. In sort of like, we'll say the quote unquote classic way of thinking about it, possession is when a demon has overtaken a person.
Mm.
Something has latched on to this human being, typically, and has kind of corrupted them, so to speak, with this demonic entity. It's more complicated than that, because possessions appeared in so many different cultures and so many different stories in different ways.
Oh.
But thinking about just the one that I'm most familiar with
Mm.
personally, it's usually that a demon has overtaken this person and they are now no longer themselves. Something about them has changed, and that itself has become like a whole complicated space for kind of that difference. That, I mean, that word again, you're no longer who you were anymore.
Right.
That otherness has kind of attached itself to you after the fact.
Mm. There's that flip, there's that switch.
Hmm.
There's definitely like, almost, I don't, like you said, there's a line. There is a
Hmm.
clear line between who you were and who you no longer are.
Hmm.
And it's often, I mean, you mentioned so many, right? Like The Exorcist, for example. I feel like that is the biggest, I don't know, like most popular version of possession in media and pop culture.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember because my dad actually used to work at back in El Paso, Texas, where I'm from.
Hmm.
There's this awesome traditional movie theater, and now it's like a big stage theater. It's really awesome. It's been reserved, like it's really cool, restored rather,
Yeah.
and it was called the Plaza Theater.
Hmm.
And my dad was working at the Plaza when that movie came out, when The
Oh
Exorcist
wow.
premiered. And he talks about it all the time. And he's like, it was like much like the Blair Witch Project, right? Like
Mhm,
it was freaking terrifying. People passed out in the movie theater. They had to have an ambulance like outside of the plaza because people were throwing up and like were scared. And like, I mean, it was like it really changed popular media for a very long time.
mhm,
There was something about it that was so haunting, and I think, as you said, right, that with possession, that transformation from a seemingly innocent individual, right, that
mhm,
could never do anything wrong, right, and how quickly that can change. I think it said a lot about the world at the time and about what could be and what people could, I don't know, experience. I mean, it was so shocking. It was so shocking for so many people. And as you said, right, there are so many different ways to explore it, though, especially now, right?
mhm,
Possession can
sure.
mean so many different things. Like, I think there is still that sense of transformation almost,
Mhm,
and something you were before that you no longer are. But I mean, people have been so freaking creative with that specific term,
mhm.
you know?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about kind of because as you said, that was sort of the first like really big popularization of the idea. And of course, it wasn't the first like book or anything to even deal with
No.
this concept by any means. There's a novel that came out a couple years before called "The Case Against Satan," and it is sort of a foundational piece as well. And I feel like it echoes some of the ideas, but it of course carries a lot of those similar themes of like the corruption of innocence.
Mm.
Um, and I think that one's interesting because it sort of touches on some of the themes that aren't necessarily as explicit in The Exorcist, where it's like, okay, but what corrupted this person?
Yeah.
In a different way. Of course, in The Exorcist, the little girl is essentially she's kind of victim blamed to some degree, where she's
Mm.
kind of meddling with things that she shouldn't have, that she didn't know
Right.
better about. Whereas the girl in Case Against Satan is a little bit older, and there's sort
Mm.
of some implications of like something may have happened to her. It's not necessarily something that's inherently her fault.
Right.
And there's some questions as well about kind of the morality and ethics of the priest himself who's involved in that one. So I think that sort of is a underknown piece in sort of the genre is thinking about kind of the groundwork for the different ways that we approach this topic. And as you say, so many people have been creative with it since too, is thinking about like who is it? Who is the quintessential victim? The classic image is usually like a young, white, able-bodied girl who's now been kind of corrupted. Um, but other books have kind of approached different angles of this, or kind of tried to like flip that on its head to some degree and unpack that a little bit. And I made an effort to do that to some degree as well in my novel, but it's kind of this space where it's like, well, what are we defining as innocent in the first place? What is that switch? And kind of is there anyone to blame here?
Mm. Well, tell us, Tyler. Tell us about this incredible novel. Pray for him and how it came about, right? How did you write it? How did you explore this? Like, tell us everything.
So for me, when it comes to horror, I'm most drawn to very character-driven stories. One of my favorite, and this is not necessarily the one people expect, I think, but Doctor Sleep by Stephen King was one of my favorite like horror books because I loved The
Yes.
Shining. I found it really interesting, kind of this exploration of kind of the human. Who is the real like monster here? Is it ghosts? Is it this father who's made his mistakes and done these
Mm-hmm.
sorts of terrible things as a human?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then I actually read it like fairly late. Like I think in my late teens maybe when I finally read it, and I found out that not that long after there was going to be this sequel, Doctor Sleep. And I found that one really interesting because if you're not familiar, the premise is what happens when that little boy who went through this terrible thing grows up. And that character it's a very character driven kind of central piece there because there's sort of a generational trauma angle, those sorts of things as well, trying to shake off the sins of the father, not being who raised you, those sorts of things as well. But that central character piece kind of always sort of drew me in when I first started falling in love with horror. So for me, when it came to writing the first novel that I released, is I wanted it to be a very character driven story. And I was really drawn to these characters who have a big heart despite kind of everything happening around them. And so I tried to think about, okay, what kind of story does that person need to go through then? And something that kind of challenges their feelings and makes them kind of face their own emotions felt like an important piece to explore. So Pray for Him centers a priest who is kind of forced to reckon with his own feelings and faith, which is quite common in the genre, but because of the fact that the person who is possessed is actually his best friend. And this other man who is very close to him, who he has a very strong friendship with, is suddenly not acting the way that he used to. And kind of trying to reckon with that, but forcing to examine sort of his own perception of this person and his own feelings at the same time. So I usually shorthand it to say like it's a closeted priest because he doesn't understand his own emotions, despite the fact that in the book he actually has kind of psychic empathy sort of abilities. He understands the hearts of others, but not his own. And so that was meant to be sort of a central theme here, is that sort of self-identity piece as well, trying to understand oneself even while you're trying to deal with this externalized threat through this so-called possession.
Freaking incredible. Just freaking brilliant, Tyler. Seriously. Like it's so like I mean it's just so awesome. And like I love I'm right there with you. I love me a character driven horror
Hmm.
storyline. That I think that's what makes great horror. Personally, I love being able to follow them all the way down and seeing all of their flaws and seeing their confusions and the things that
Hmm.
make them human, or monstrous or
Yeah.
both, interchangeable maybe. And I think that's what's so cool about your narrative. Right. I think that's so brilliant. I think it's so clever. I think so many people can relate to that, that
Hmm.
exploration. And it's just great. It's just great. I love that. I love that you came up with it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it think for me also it was an opportunity to sort of explore different facets of identity as well,
Yes.
because we have two men who are a little bit older, I would say, than the typical like protagonist in a lot of like queer centric narratives. It's very
Yeah.
common to see younger books being kind of pushed when it comes to that, which are important in their own right. But then it sometimes feels like there's a dearth of stories about people who are self-discovering this queer identity in a slightly later place. And so the main character of Pray for Him isn't necessarily like that old, but he's kind of past what's supposed to have been his coming of age. He's no longer necessarily like a young person, a young adult anymore. Um, I never gave an age on page for him, but it's heavily implied he's at least in his 30s.
Yeah.
He's enough of an adult that you're expected to have an understanding of who you are.
Right.
And so being forced to kind of unravel this own identity as well, which happens for many queer people, that it's not until your 30s, your 40s, 50s, or 60s, some people it's not until much later in life that they fully are able to accept their own identity or even understand it or have the vocabulary for it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was one of the things that felt important too, was kind of pushing that kind of narrative of the self exploration. And when that happens as well, you're kind of forced to look inwards as well as your worldview is changing.
Yes. It's I don't know. I mean, being a person is so complicated, to say the least. There's no rule book on
Hmm.
what the hell we're all doing here,
Absolutely.
ever, right? And I think that it was a great choice, to create a human, right? To
Hmm.
build a human in this character, one that is confused and unsure. And I love again the added tidbit, right? That it's almost, he's almost so intuitive with other people. He understands others and just not himself. Or I love that. I think that is so so smart, and again adds to this world of fantastical horror so well. Is being so afraid of,
Hmm.
maybe even yourself, you being afraid of the unknown, and that being yourself,
Hmm.
is often the most terrifying monster many of us will ever face, in our
Absolutely.
life,
And there's a sort of sense perhaps that like, given this overarching theme that often occurs in this possession narratives, whether it's the one I described earlier or The
Yeah.
Exorcist, where you have Father Karras kind of doubting his own faith and his own strength as well, it's very common for this sort of seed of doubt to exist here.
Mm.
And it's sort of like you mentioned that sometimes it feels like in Catholicism that it's like you were born doing something wrong.
Yeah.
So there's this sense of like, what if you're not enough? Are you enough in this case to save the person that you care for, that you suddenly feel like you have a responsibility for?
Mm.
And if you can't save them, can you save yourself?
Mm.
And what's sort of the which has to happen first? Even like, are you good enough? Do you have to be? And all those sorts of pieces as well that you're sort of forced to reckon with it in theory.
Oh, uh, it's wonderful. It's great. I love it. I love it so much. Everybody, please go read it. We're gonna link everything down below, by the way, Tyler. So everybody, please
Awesome.
go
Thank you.
read this novel. It's amazing. It's just it's a brilliant concept. It's wonderful. It's so wonderful.
Thank you.
And I'm just so happy. I'm so happy that you chose this specific exploration to talk about more today, which is great. And again, you've said so many amazing things so far in terms of kind of right, like the parallels
Hmm.
of demons and or possession in that way. And I want to pick your brain on more of the parallels that you have made
Hmm.
already. So can you elaborate more on maybe the parallels of possession, demons, what have you, and the exploration of trauma? I know you've
Hmm.
mentioned generational trauma a couple of times already too, but yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
I think part of the challenge with demons is that there's a kind of historical cultural root that's assumed to be when, there's a reason people believed this sort of thing was happening in the first place. And
Yeah.
frequently that could be associated, or at least we understand it to be likely enough associated with a change in a person. And this could be due to illness. Frequently people kind of cite that potentially mental illness was connected to why suddenly people thought there was something wrong with this other person. But I think there's also, especially given where the genre frequently goes, an element of like gendered trauma as well.
Mm.
If we think about, for instance, The Exorcist, the most iconic kind of image in pop culture for it, we're talking about a young girl who's suddenly kind of like changed, and there's sort of this element of like victimization to it.
Mhm.
And you can unpack a lot there about kind of like who is the victim versus the savior and those sorts of things as well. But I think there's some really interesting pieces to be said about kind of what kind of metaphors could be made for trauma there as well. Um, there's a TV show version of The Exorcist as well. It takes place in sort of the same universe.
Yeah.
One of my absolute favorite pieces of media,
Yeah.
for sure.
Love
And
that.
there's sort of conversations around that as well in that piece as well. And I'm going to try to avoid saying anything that could be constituted as a spoiler, but there's an element of sort of like thinking about the possession as a form of trauma in and of itself, whether
Yeah.
it's a response to a trauma or it itself is the traumatic event.
Mm.
Um, and so I think thinking about a lot of the books and media that have come in the past, it's very easy to see the possession as itself sort of a metaphor for this trauma. Perhaps something happened to this person.
Yeah.
There's a novel from a couple of years ago called My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. That's another one where it's a traumatic event happens to this woman, this young woman, and that's what sort of starts to lead the way to this exorcism story.
Mm.
And in that one in particular, it's initially explored as, oh, she's changed because of this traumatic event.
Mm.
It's not that she's possessed, she's lashing out and these sorts of things because something terrible has happened to her. And it's not even confirmed that something did happen to her. It's just highly speculated on by the other characters. Because another piece that's quite common in these is that the person who's possessed is almost never the point of view character. That's something quite common as well. They're almost
Mm.
always being viewed as this otherized identity. They're being perceived. Um, and so we don't know for sure what happened to this person in this example, but it seems to be, at least initially, like a reaction to a traumatic event. And that's quite common, I think, as well, where there's something that's happened or changed. And so it's easy to view, I think, possession and this sort of whole narrative as itself a form of trauma.
Ooh, you just blew my mind. I never thought about, yeah, perspective. Like it's so rare for us to actually know or understand any of what the individual that's
Hmm.
possessed is thinking. it is always just the narrative is put on them, right?
Hmm.
Like they don't
Absolutely.
necessarily have any autonomy
Yeah, which
in a
really goes back to that idea too of the kind of the monstrous, the other as well, is that
yeah.
this person's sort of being made other by the narrative itself.
Yes. And therefore, right, also by the viewer, by the reader, by the
Hmm.
watcher, right? Like you are that's what you're implying, that's what you're watching. And that is, I mean, that as you said, that is so ugh, hauntingly similar to individuals that have experienced some sort of trauma
Hmm.
and in so many different facets. And I think, I mean, there's almost a scientific nature to it, right? Because in a lot of cases, and everybody's different, of course, but people that
Of
go through
course.
severe trauma, right? Like, I mean, so many actual bodily changes happen
Hmm.
to you, literally, like on paper. Like, there's a lot of cases, obviously, where memory becomes incredibly
Hmm.
fuzzy, where your brain will literally try to protect you by completely blacking out or just choosing like, hey, you know what? We're not going to be thinking about this ever again. So there's no need for you to
Hmm.
remember any of this, right? Like whole chunks of your life,
Hmm.
um, just gone. Um,
Absolutely.
and or like even if we're thinking about right disability, right? And
Hmm.
I have an autoimmune disorder, and
Hmm.
obviously I think people are still learning so much about them, and we all are learning so much about no clue. And in a lot of cases, how a lot of these autoimmune disorders can be inflicted just by trauma, just
Hmm.
by immense stress on the body, on the mind. And I mean, it's so interesting how much things like that, right? Like parallel what a definition of a possession is, or if
Absolutely.
confronting a demon. It's all of these. You are no longer yourself. You
Hmm.
don't know maybe even
Absolutely.
who you were. You don't have the ability to
Hmm.
explain even who you are, whether that's in the medical system that can be so complicated, whether
Hmm.
that's in society, which can be so freaking complicated, right? Like I just love that I love that you made that connection.
And it's interesting the example you use because I'm thinking also about how sometimes it's the converse. In fact, I was thinking about recently because of something I was writing, the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, that famous sculpture.
Ooh, yeah.
And when you read about the life of Saint Teresa and the divine kind of visions that she said, these rapturous things that were.
Yeah.
They have this sort of like psychosexual undertone, but they're
Mm.
generally viewed as quite positive. But then when you think about people speculating on what was actually happening to this woman, it's frequently said, like, oh, she may have had epilepsy. These may have been seizures. This may have itself been something health related, something going on in her body mind that kind of was out of her control.
Yeah.
But in this instance, it has a positive connotation with the sort of things that she was seeing. Mind you, there's sort of, I feel like, a complexity there where, when the way that it's been portrayed has sometimes been itself viewed as sort of like scandalous or blasphemous in different ways as well,
Definitely.
which of course is its own very interesting thing to unpack.
Yeah.
But so many of these things depends on the narrative that is being written for you by other people. How are you perceived, and this sort of thing. And I think that was something that was interesting for me to try to explore as well, because
Hmm.
to think about my book, for instance, it's like many books in this genre. I can think of very few where it's a central viewpoint is the person who is possessed.
Yeah.
I can only think of one right now.
Yeah.
Um, but the so much of the narrative ends up being talking about this other person,
Mm.
viewing this other person and trying to understand them, that they kind of have that agency removed to some degree. And I made an effort to subvert some of that as well, and kind of return some agency to this character. But I think it's a difficult thing to do, and I don't know necessarily how successful I was in that. But the conversations around these topics, I think, become really important, especially making sure that I have this cast of queer and disabled characters. Almost everybody in the cast is one or the other,
Yeah.
or both. And that means that there's sort of this complexity when it comes to, like, the title is Pray for Him. And we think about how often that's the sort of language that's been weaponized against queer and disabled bodies. And so that was something that was important to try and distance from at the same time, is what exactly is it that we're trying to fix? What are we deeming
Mm.
wrong with this person? And so especially having a cast that's made up predominantly of queer and or disabled characters, that was important to kind of put a specific kind of distance from and understanding of.
And kudos to you for doing that. I mean, it's so important. And I feel like even more hard hitting when,
Mhm.
as you said, right, the whole concept of possession demonology is trying to figure out what broke.
Mhm.
And I think that is so hard to hear when you're like, "Oh, I'm broken. I didn't think of it that way." And that
Mhm.
again, depending on who's weaponizing the term, right? That can feel very, very isolating and very confusing. And I
Mhm.
don't know. I love your decision to play with perspective, to play with agency, as you said,
Mhm.
right? And give it to people for once.
Mhm.
And I mean that makes it so brilliant, like so
Mhm.
exciting to keep reading.
Yeah. My personal favorite character in the book, even though she's not the point of view character, is the possessed person's daughter, Violet. And she was a really important character for me in the end, because she is physically disabled as well as implied to have neurodivergency and things like that. Like she is a explicitly disabled and queer character. And one of my absolute favorite moments to write is when she talks to the priest and acknowledges that he is one of the few people who has never prayed for her, at least not like that. He cares about her. It's his own way of expressing love in some ways to want the best for them, and sometimes prayer is his method of expressing that. But he never prayed for her because there was something wrong with her, whereas others have
Mhm.
put that sort of perception on her. And so she was a really important character for me to include and to kind of flesh out in this way because she's actually the one who initially comes and identifies straight from the beginning of the book. So I don't think this is a spoiler for my own
No,
book,
no.
but she speaks out to say, I think there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And she is the one who takes control of the situation. And that was one of the things that I tried to kind of break apart a little bit because normally if we're talking about a young woman in a narrative like that, she is the one who would be victimized. And so I tried to give that agency back to her to some degree as well, that she's the one who tries to take control of the situation and say that she knows what she knows. She understands the situation, and people can't put that narrative on her. So even though she's not the one who's being kind of victimized by this situation, which was itself an important choice for me personally,
Yeah.
but that she's able to have some kind of control over this situation and kind of express her frustrations, call the shots to some degree. And without her, the whole narrative would probably just fall apart. And
Non-exist.
that was
Yeah.
something very important for me.
Oh. I love that. I love that you're just giving, well-deserved agency to so many of these characters, right? Like that is so necessary. It's so important. It's just so important. I just always think of, right, like the children and like the people in the world that are dealing with so much right now. Like that's what you need
Mm-hmm.
to see. That's what you need to be exposed to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are these narratives in which that is being done?
Mm-hmm.
Kudos. That's freaking awesome. That's such a brilliant choice. And I know you're probably like, it wasn't a second thought. Like I was gonna do it anyway, right? But that's great. It's great.
Well, it's actually interesting because I think a lot changed from the first draft of the book to the latter, and I think kind of making sure I had a strong handle on her role in the narrative was one of the things that I wanted to make sure that was shaped strongly from the first draft to the last.
Yeah.
And I think of a lot of the supporting characters and side characters as the core of the story in general,
Yeah.
which is sort of its own thing where a lot of it has to do with the community that this character has found himself in.
Mm,
There's sort of to use like the trope terminology, a bit of a found family element to it to
mm,
some degree. And some of
yes.
them are literally family. Like I said, the girl is the daughter of the possessed man, but who kind of takes control of the situation. But then so many other characters kind of come together that this community support and not being alone in this is an important element as well.
Mm. I think that's something too, right? Like to the exploration of demons and possession is the
Hmm.
idea of loneliness.
Hmm.
From right at the beginning, right when we were talking about demons and this idea of falling from grace and what have you, a very isolating experience,
Hmm.
right? It's made that I feel like that story is very much made to make you feel, detached from
Hmm.
society, as you mentioned, right? Like completely alone. And I'm excited that your story explores that in so many different ways, in so many different facets, with so many different characters,
Hmm.
right? It's just not the main one per se.
Hmm.
And I think that's so that's so important. And such a loneliness is such a horror story in and of itself, and I think it relates so brilliantly, unfortunately, to the explorations of
Mhm.
demons.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of it comes down to that piece about otherness and how we define what is monstrous or demonic in the first place is
Yeah.
that kind of ostracization and this otherness that's been kind of assigned to that the piece again about sort of what is the way that you're being perceived, how the narrative has structured you,
Mm.
and a lot of it, yeah, it has to do with kind of that loneliness. And there's when we're talking about exorcism and possession media in particular, there's that sort of undercurrent of like God has abandoned you. That's sort of like part of
Yeah.
what the fear is based on,
Hmm.
with a lot of religious horror is like, what if we're alone after all? What if there isn't something bigger out there that has my best interests in mind?
Hmm.
And that is a tenet of this, and why I think there's often, kind of, at least in my mind, a bit of an overlap with like cosmic horror,
Yes.
because this idea that there's something else out there, whether good or bad, is part of the fear. Or conversely, often in religious horror, that maybe there isn't something after all. And what does that mean?
Oof. I love it. I love it. I love it. I think that that's such a brilliant point. I love the connection to cosmic horror. Again, talk about loneliness, right?
Hmm.
Talk about feeling like so small,
Hmm.
in comparison to everything else in the world, having no
Yeah.
control.
Hmm.
I love that they fit hand in hand
Yeah.
with one
One of
another.
my favorite anthologies that I've been in, actually technically there's two, is called The Cozy Cosmic and Even
Mm.
Cozier Cosmic. And both of them were meant to be centered on this idea of this cosmic horror reality is happening, but we're still living our lives.
Oh.
And I thought it was a really brilliant concept for both anthologies, and I feel honored I was able to be included in both. And the story in both is that I wrote for both of them, each story kind of deals with in different ways these characters who are just trying to live their lives and continue on despite all these things happening around them.
Mm.
And I find that also sort of an interesting piece to explore sometimes, where maybe somebody doesn't want to be the chosen one. They don't want to deal with all this. They just have bills to pay and a family to
Yeah.
feed and all
Yeah.
these sorts of things. So I find it sort of so interesting when we think about these sort of big picture horrors, whether it's cosmic horror, religious horror, or otherwise, that
Yeah.
people also still just have lives. And what does this mean for those lives? Is it completely off rails, or do they try to continue to exist and be human despite everything that's happening?
Ooh. Because that's a horror story, right? Like just continuing on day to day in your
It
life.
yeah, yeah,
That's
absolutely.
brilliant. I immediately thought of, I don't know if you've seen on social media circulating those videos of like what I would do if Godzilla just like zapped my, or I could see him outside my window zapping everything. And it's like, all right, I mean, what am I supposed to do? Like, what do you do in that? I guess I'm not going to work tomorrow. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
It's
There's a press I really love, called Archive of the Odd. And
ooh,
bias disclaimer, I'm friends with the editor in chief of
hey,
that one.
that's
But
awesome.
one of my favorite stories that was published in one of their issues is like this cosmic entity has come and it's going to take over the world, but and now it's hired like a PR firm, and the people who work for the PR firm are like just trying to go about their daily lives, and they're like, yeah, I guess I have to write like a brand management thing for this cosmic entity to convince people it's a good thing actually that it wants to take over the world.
That's
And it's just such an
brilliant.
interesting, like, it's a humorous take on this sort of like cosmic horror of like, I just got to keep on living.
Yeah.
I gotta pick up the coffee, but they blew up the coffee shop, that sort of vibe.
Yeah.
And I just think it's a really interesting kind of angle for this type of horror.
Oh,
Albeit, yeah, as I said, that one's sort of a humorous, sort of tongue-in-cheek take on it. But I remember that one really stood out to me just because it's so much of this, like, well, I guess I still have, work to deliver to the boss tomorrow.
yeah, I gotta make this guy look real good. Like,
Yeah.
that's so funny. That's awesome. That is such a brilliant concept. That's so great. That's so great. Okay. Well, again, Tyler, I know we could talk about this for hours and hours and hours if we really wanted to, but we're going down to our last few questions.
Okay.
And, after all of these years, whether, that's through
Mhm.
books or storytelling, um, any of the sort. Why do you think, demons have followed you for so long? Why have they made such a big impact in your life?
I think it's a lot of it has to do with that sort of existential threat of it. So much of it is tied to this idea of like inherent good or evil, and that itself is sort of a scary concept. That there's something like immutable about those characteristics that maybe it makes you feel a little bit small, where it's like, how much of my actions really matter? How much of this is predetermined? Um, and I think it's just interesting to kind of explore those and talk about that agency again, and what the narrative that's been written for you is, to go back to those themes we talked about, because so much of it just feels out of your control. And so
Mhm.
I think that's become something that's really interesting for me to explore for that reason too, because it's a form of taking control of it, to unpack your own thoughts, and in this case, kind of write a literal narrative, albeit not your own, to try and understand these and reckon with these concepts, and find kind of what's the good and the bad in the situation, and try to find the light, but also really explore what the darkness means and what can be found
Mm.
in the darkness too.
That's awesome. It's a brilliant way to answer these questions, or not even, right? Just like deal with them,
Hmm.
in some form or fashion. Great answer. Great answer. Well, do you think a demon is a monster? Why or why not?
I think in the strictest definition of like the other piece that we talked about, if we
Yeah.
set that as our definition, then yes, in that it's something that's been made to be other. It's something that is not necessarily understood, that's been demarcated in some way as separate from what we consider kind of like the good base standard, that
Mm.
corruption of innocence piece. But I think if we unpack it a little bit more, or maybe not necessarily, maybe it's a little bit more complex, as most things are more complex. Like
Always.
when we think about that origin story being kind of tied directly to what is considered like the moral opposite of angels, that it's a little more complicated, because is anything ever really going to just be a flip of the switch and you go from 100% good to 100% evil? And
Yeah.
I think that's what makes possession really interesting too, is because that corruption piece, how much of the person who used to be is in there? Can they come back, but will they ever be the same person again, because of this traumatic thing that's happened to them? So I
Mm.
think it's by nature like more complex than that, but
Yeah.
through the sense of like being othered, that it's something that is viewed as monstrous at the very least.
Yeah. And again, as you mentioned, right, who gets whatever definition they're using that day, whoever is defining it that day, it highly
Mhm.
depends on the context of that.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
maybe to some people there's something good about this entity. There's a
Yeah.
novel about somebody who it's post-exorcism, and it's like, "No, actually, I wanted that
I
demon
want it
back."
back.
Yeah, I liked that demon, actually. And,
Yeah.
the book, of course, would then go on to, like, unpack whether that's, like, a correct assumption or not, but
Yeah.
maybe to somebody, "Oh, actually, like, that was my friend." Like, so often you hear these when you think
Mhm.
about the sort of possession and ghost stories that involve young children, there's often an element of, like, "This scary thing in my closet is actually something I befriended." And
Yeah.
usually the story then goes to, like, "Maybe you shouldn't have befriended it, actually." But
Right.
maybe depending on the eye of the beholder, like, maybe that's something that pushes back the loneliness a little bit.
You are finally not seen as monstrous
Mhm,
yourself, maybe in that,
mhm,
and I feel like in a lot of these narratives too, you're right, right? Like there is almost a sense of strength that
mhm,
these demons can can give you, right? Like
mhm,
they actually, as you said, right, there are these really stark turns from a very innocent individual, right, to what are you doing, right? But in many cases, they're just sticking up for themselves finally, or
mhm,
talking back finally, right? Or
mhm,
like being brave enough to say the things that nobody else in the room could. There
mhm,
is that sense of I don't know, just badassery, I guess. I guess you could say, right, with a lot of demons. And so I think that
mhm,
is a very interesting take on it. It could be monstrous. But that doesn't
mhm.
necessarily have to mean a negative thing by any
Yeah, and I think that's something that's been unpacked in a lot of horror spaces, particularly by marginalized authors too, is sort of what is that line that's being drawn? Is the person themselves monstrous, and is that a method for them to kind of like take it back? Is there some power to be found in that?
always, yeah. Yeah. Well, why are monsters so important, Tyler? And like why should we talk about them, explore them, right? Read about them, watch content about them. Why are they so necessary?
I think it goes back to that empowerment piece. I think that it can be a really powerful tool either to see oneself represented because you yourself feel like you've been othered, that you've been made monstrous, but also as a way to kind of unpack these different fears. Like I mentioned, a lot of authors in the indie space have sort of been able to put their own spins that aren't necessarily given a voice in the mainstream to say, this is how my mental illness feels to me. This is how my disability, my queerness, what have you, feel, and kind of give a voice to that in its way. And because these things have been so often given a label of monstrous,
Mm,
that kind of gives a sort of power, I think, to people who are able to see or explore these narratives themselves, because it takes that back, it subverts that, and gives that power back to the person who's able to say, you know what, maybe I am a monster. Maybe there is something powerful in that. Or
mm,
perhaps, kind of conversely, that maybe the monster isn't the monster that we all thought it was. The
mm.
sympathy for the monster, which then kind of brings, well, if we can have empathy for this, can we not have empathy for ourselves?
Again, that externalization we were
Hmm.
talking about, and feeling, that
Absolutely.
feeling can be so
Hmm.
monstrous in such a wonderful way. Um,
Absolutely.
you
And
know,
there's
it,
something to be said about, trying to face those fears as well. What is it about
yes.
the monster that we're afraid of? And is that something that we need to be afraid of? Can we unpack that feeling as well?
Mm. Which can be hard.
Absolutely.
Such right, and it might
Hmm.
take a really long time, but you're right.
Hmm.
It starts the conversation at the very least.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, final question, Tyler. Say, okay, you're just chilling, the snowstorm happened, as it would, right? Maybe you're just relaxing, having your Sunday. And all of a sudden, and now the way it appears to you is completely up to you, but a
Hmm.
demon does make itself known to you. Now, this could be possessing you,
Hmm.
or it could be possessing someone else, or it could be a demon in their own form, right? Appearing to you. What would you do in that situation, or what would you say?
It's a tough one. I feel like realistically, I'd probably be back to the little kid hiding behind my hands when I'm trying to watch the Blair Witch through my fingers. Um,
Absolutely.
but in a perfect world where I felt that I had, agency and control over the situation, where I felt empowered to be able to speak up, I think I'd want to understand. I think I'd want to understand where this entity, whatever it may be, came from, and what, did something happen? Does it have its own trauma? If we think about that fall from grace, is that not a form of trauma in and of itself? So I think, I don't know if there'd be a specific question, but I think I'd try to understand, because I think, barring the fear
Yeah.
factor, but
Yeah.
I think that comes down to a lot of it. The issues is like, do we actually understand, and are we willing to try and build that bridge to empathy, to understanding? And I think maybe that would be the first step to trying to unpack and take control of the situation.
Said in true Tyler fashion, again, giving agency to people that definitely need it. And I love that you were like, let's give them some perspective, right? Like, talk to me. How do you
Mhm.
feel? How are you? In the right, how are things been? Right? How have things been? And I think that's awesome.
Maybe you need somebody to talk to
Yeah,
here.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Have a seat. Let's have a
Yeah.
snack or something.
Mhm.
That's
Make a pot of tea.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. We'll watch the Blair Witch Project together. It'll be
Yeah,
scary, but it'll be great. Maybe they just need a friend.
maybe there's some of that cosmic loneliness to fight back on.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And you're both, I don't know, becoming friends. I see it's a story that writes itself, Tyler. Start writing this down, make a movie.
I'm on it. I'm on it.
It's great. It's great. Well, Tyler, thank you so freaking much for being on the show and for just doing so wonderfully in the world of writing and novel creation. I mean, your work is freaking stellar and so important, and I'm just
Thank you.
so thankful to talk to you today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation. I was really looking forward to it and did not disappoint. Very happy about the various topics we got to talk about, and kind of helping I find it really great to have these spaces to kind of bounce off of each other and unpack these things together and think about things that when you don't have that other perspective, when you remove that second viewpoint, that it's a lot harder to kind of like have a full picture. So really appreciate you inviting me and taking this time. It was a really great conversation and has left a lot for me to think about as well.
I'm so glad. Me too. I mean, it's all just geeking out about, right, like the things that we love the most. And it's always so fun to
Mhm.
challenge these definitions and challenge these perspectives over and over and over again to find new
Mhm.
venues and ways
Absolutely.
of communication. And,
Mhm.
again, I feel like your writing does that for so many people. So thank you in turn. Thank you for doing this. It was a true
Thank you.
pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you.
This episode of Floaties for Krakens was written and recorded by me, Camille Maria Acosta. A monstrous thank you to Tyler Battaglia for such an inspirational interview. A big thank you to Michael Kostman for producing a stellar episode, and a huge thank you to Natalie Hedberg for designing such a phenomenal logo. And music for the show was also written and produced by me, with a special appearance by my tata, Toby Acosta. Thank you all so much for tuning in to today's show. It truly means the world to me. If you have questions or curiosities about the research or media referenced in today's episode, everything will hopefully be in the description box. And you can find us on our website and our socials. Links in the description as well. Anyway, thanks again for being here, everyone. And just a reminder, it's okay to be afraid of the monster, but it's also okay to love the heck out of it too. Keep being monstrous and keep shining bright.